Let me start with something most people misunderstand about avoidant behavior. They think the thing that breaks an avoidant is silence. They think if you disappear long enough, stop texting, stop calling, stop checking their social media, eventually that person will panic and come running back. And sometimes distance does create curiosity. Sometimes silence creates a reaction. But reaction is not transformation. If you build your entire strategy around getting a reaction from another person, you are still giving that person control over your emotional state. The deeper shift happens when you stop trying to convince them and start living without their validation. Think about what happens psychologically when you are constantly trying to prove your value to someone who keeps pulling away. You explain your intentions. You reassure them. You tell them how much you care. You analyze every message. You wonder whether you should reach out or wait. You change your behavior because you believe that if you can just find the right combination of patience, understanding, affection, and distance, you can finally make them feel safe enough to choose you. But underneath all of that is a dangerous assumption that your worth is something another person gets to determine. It isn't. And this is where the entire dynamic begins to change. When you stop seeking validation, you're not becoming cold. You're not pretending you don't care. You're not playing some psychological game designed to make the avoidant chase you. You're doing something far more powerful. You're removing yourself from the position of auditioning for love. Because the moment you believe you have to earn someone's basic consistency, you have already surrendered too much power. You begin measuring yourself through their behavior. If they text, you feel valuable. If they disappear, you feel rejected. If they come closer, you feel hopeful. If they pull away, you question yourself. Your emotional world becomes a scoreboard controlled by another human being. That's not love. That's emotional dependence disguised as devotion. And here's the paradox. The more desperately you try to convince an avoidant that you're safe, valuable, loyal, understanding, and worthy of commitment, the less opportunity they have to confront their own choices. You are carrying the emotional responsibility for two people. You are doing their work for them. Real self-respect changes that. You begin saying, I can love you without chasing you. I can understand your fears without allowing those fears to dictate my life. I can have compassion for your wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. That's maturity. And psychologically, this is significant because healthy boundaries change the reinforcement pattern. If every withdrawal is followed by your pursuit, then withdrawal has a predictable consequence. They get distance while still retaining access to your attention, reassurance, and emotional energy. But when you stop participating in that pattern, something changes. Not because you're punishing them, because you're no longer abandoning yourself to preserve the relationship. And that's the distinction I want you to remember. The goal isn't to make an avoidant realize what they're losing. The goal is to realize what you are losing every time you abandon your own standards just to keep someone close. You were losing peace. You were losing focus. You were losing confidence. You were losing the ability to trust your own judgment. And eventually you reach a point where you say, I don't need to convince anyone of my value anymore. If someone cannot recognize what I bring into their life, I don't have to argue with their perception. I simply have to decide what I will and will not accept. That is where the power shifts. And notice how different that is from silence. Silence says, I hope you notice I'm gone. Self-respect says, whether you notice or not, I'm still moving forward. That's the psychological break in the pattern. Because when you genuinely stop needing their validation, their behavior loses the ability to define you. And once their behavior can no longer control your emotional state, you become free to make decisions from strength instead of fear. So don't disappear hoping they'll chase you. Don't withdraw hoping they'll panic. Don't become unavailable as a strategy. Become unavailable to disrespect, inconsistency, emotional confusion, and the endless cycle of proving that you deserve what should never have required proof. Because the moment you stop asking, how do I make them choose me? And start asking, why would I abandon myself to be chosen? Your entire life changes. You don't break the pattern by making them feel your absence. You break it by finally feeling your own worth. Now, once you stop trying to convince someone of your value, something else begins to happen. You stop trying to control the outcome. And that leads us to a truth that most people discover only after they've exhausted themselves emotionally. One of the most confronting things for an avoidant is not your anger, not your pleading, and not even your silence. It's realizing that you can walk away without becoming bitter, because anger still creates a connection. Pleading still creates a connection. Constantly asking for answers still creates a connection. Even emotional chaos can reassure someone that they still occupy a powerful position in your mind. But calm detachment is different. When you can look at someone you genuinely cared about and say, I wanted this to work, but I will not destroy myself trying to make it work, something fundamental changes. You're no longer participating in the old emotional negotiation. And understand this carefully. Walking away does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop confusing caring with self-abandonment. There is an enormous psychological difference between rejection and acceptance. Rejection says, you hurt me, so I'm going to make you understand what you lost. Acceptance says, this hurts, but I accept that I cannot make another person choose what they're not ready to choose. That second position requires emotional strength, because when someone has an avoidant pattern, their distancing can sometimes create a powerful temptation in the other person to prove themselves. You start thinking, maybe if I become more patient, more understanding, less demanding, less emotional, they'll finally feel safe. You gradually shrink your needs to accommodate their discomfort. But love cannot become healthy when one person must continuously become smaller so the other person can remain comfortable. Eventually, you have to ask a more important question. What happens to me if I keep participating in this? That's where walking away becomes powerful. Not because you're trying to trigger regret, not because you're hoping they'll chase, not because you're trying to teach them a lesson. You walk away because your life has value beyond the outcome of this relationship. And when someone sees that you can leave without becoming cruel, vindictive, or desperate, they encounter something they cannot easily dismiss. They see emotional self-possession. You don't need to destroy their image of themselves. You don't need to expose them. You don't need to announce your transformation. You simply become someone who can hold love in one hand and boundaries in the other. That's strength. And here's the philosophical depth of it. You cannot control whether another person chooses you, but you can control whether you continue choosing circumstances that diminish you. That is where personal power begins. You stop asking, how can I get them back? You start asking, what kind of relationship am I willing to participate in? So you stop asking, what do they need from me so they won't leave? You start asking, what do I need in order to remain emotionally healthy? Those questions produce an entirely different life. And here's something else people often misunderstand. If the avoidant eventually comes back because they genuinely recognize your value, that's their journey. But if they come back only because they cannot tolerate losing access to you, that's not necessarily transformation. You must learn to distinguish someone's fear of losing you from their capacity to love you consistently. Those are not the same thing. Real change is demonstrated through behavior, accountability, communication, and consistency, not through one emotional return. So your mission is not to create the perfect disappearance that finally makes them panic. Your mission is to become so grounded that whether they return or don't return, you remain whole. Because the most powerful person in the relationship is not the one who can make the other person chase. It's the one who no longer needs to be chased to know they are worthy. Walk away without hatred. Leave without revenge. Choose yourself without needing them to regret losing you. Your greatest power is not making them fear your absence. It's becoming at peace with your life without their presence. And once you reach that point, once you can walk away without bitterness, you discover something even more important. You discover that the real power was never in disappearing. It was in becoming emotionally independent enough that another person's withdrawal no longer determines your behavior. Because avoidance can become powerful when it controls the emotional rhythm of a relationship. They move closer, you feel relief. They pull away, you feel anxiety. They return, you feel hope. They disappear again, you start questioning everything. That cycle can become psychologically addictive. Not because you're weak, but because uncertainty creates heightened emotional attention. Your mind begins searching for patterns, explanations, and solutions. You become focused on predicting the next move instead of living your own life. And that's exactly why emotional escape can become a form of control, even when nobody consciously intends it that way. The avoidant withdraws because closeness creates discomfort. You pursue because distance creates discomfort. One person moves away to regulate themselves, the other moves closer to regulate themselves. And suddenly both people are reacting to anxiety rather than responding from conscious choice. That's the cycle you have to break, not by becoming colder, by becoming grounded. When you stop reacting predictably to every withdrawal, you change the emotional equation. If someone pulls away and you immediately chase, explain, reassure, and demand answers, the pattern reinforces itself. Their withdrawal produces your pursuit, and your pursuit temporarily gives them reassurance that the connection remains available without requiring them to confront the deeper discomfort of intimacy. But when you remain calm and continue living your life, something different happens. You haven't punished them. You haven't manipulated them. You've simply refused to make their emotional regulation your responsibility. And that distinction matters enormously. Healthy relationships require two adults capable of managing their own internal worlds. You can support someone. You can listen. You can offer reassurance. But you cannot become their nervous system. You cannot spend your life trying to prevent another person from feeling uncomfortable. At some point, they must learn that intimacy involves vulnerability, communication, uncertainty, and emotional responsibility. Those experiences cannot be eliminated simply because you become more accommodating. And this is where your independence becomes so powerful. When you stop making yourself constantly available to someone who repeatedly withdraws, you're not trying to make them feel abandoned. You're establishing reality. Access to you is connected to mutual effort. That's a boundary, not a punishment. And boundaries are psychologically different from threats. A threat says, if you don't do what I want, I'll leave. A boundary says, if this relationship continues to operate this way, I will choose what is healthy for me. One is an attempt to control another person. The other is an act of self-governance. That's the philosophical shift. You stop trying to control their choices and start controlling your participation. And once you do that, the avoidant no longer has the same ability to pull you into an emotional chase. Your attention is no longer guaranteed. Your energy is no longer automatically available. Your life does not stop every time they create distance. That can be confronting because it forces the other person to encounter the consequences of their own behavior. But remember, the goal is not to make them uncomfortable. The goal is to stop making yourself uncomfortable just to keep them comfortable. There's a huge difference. You don't need to become unpredictable. You need to become consistent with your own values. You don't need to play hard to get. You need to stop being easy to lose. And if they eventually recognize the change, that's their responsibility to process. If they don't, you still win something far more important, your emotional freedom. Because the ultimate victory isn't making someone afraid to lose you. It's reaching the point where their fear of losing you is no longer necessary for you to feel secure. So stop asking, what can I do to make them chase? Ask instead, what kind of behavior am I willing to participate in? Stop trying to control their emotional distance. Control your own direction. When their withdrawal can no longer control your reaction, their distance loses its power, and your life gets its power back. And when you stop reacting to their withdrawal, you eventually reach the next stage. They may begin to realize that your absence is not a strategy. It is a new reality. That distinction is enormous because silence can be temporary. Someone can stay quiet for a week, 2 weeks, even a month, while secretly waiting for the other person to break first. That's still a game of emotional positioning. Both people remain psychologically connected to the same question: who will make the next move? But real emotional independence is different. You are no longer sitting somewhere counting the days until they notice you're gone. You're not checking your phone hoping for a message. You're not posting things designed to make them curious. You're not asking mutual friends whether they've mentioned you. You're not constructing your life around the possibility that they'll suddenly return. You're actually moving forward. And psychologically, that is where absence becomes meaningful. Because the human mind often understands value differently when access is no longer guaranteed. When someone has become accustomed to your availability, your reassurance, your attention, and your willingness to repair every rupture, they may unconsciously treat those things as permanent. But permanence is an illusion. People sometimes don't recognize what they had because they never had to experience life without it. Then reality changes. You stop initiating every conversation. You stop repairing every emotional distance. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop waiting for someone to decide whether they want to participate in your life. And suddenly, the person who once assumed you would always be there has to confront a different reality. You are capable of building a meaningful life without them. That can be psychologically confronting. But don't misunderstand what I'm saying. This is not about creating scarcity so someone becomes obsessed with you. That's manipulation. And manipulation is still dependence because you're still trying to control their emotional response. The deeper principle is much more powerful. You allow reality to speak for itself. If someone consistently chooses distance, you don't have to punish them. You simply stop fighting reality. If they aren't ready for intimacy, you don't have to convince them. If they cannot offer consistency, you don't have to manufacture consistency for both of you. If they choose to leave, you don't have to spend your life standing at the door. You move. And moving forward doesn't mean forgetting someone overnight. It means refusing to make your healing dependent on their return. There may be moments when you miss them. There may be nights when you wonder whether they miss you. That's human. Emotional independence doesn't mean emotional numbness. It means your feelings are allowed to exist without becoming commands. You can miss someone and still move forward. You can love someone and still maintain boundaries. You can hope they grow and still refuse to wait for them. That's emotional maturity. And eventually something fascinating can happen. The avoidant may begin to realize that your previous availability was not an entitlement. It was a gift. Your patience was a gift. Your understanding was a gift. Your willingness to communicate was a gift. Your emotional presence was a gift. And gifts lose their meaning when the recipient assumes they are guaranteed forever. This is why genuine change is so much more powerful than silence. Silence asks, will they notice I'm gone? Growth asks, who am I becoming now that I'm no longer organizing my life around their presence? That's the question that transforms you. Because if they return, you need to be able to evaluate their behavior from a position of clarity rather than desperation. You need to ask whether anything has actually changed. Not, do they miss me? But, can they meet me? Not, are they afraid of losing me? But, are they capable of building something healthy with me? Or, those questions protect you from confusing emotional reaction with emotional growth. So let them experience reality. Don't chase them into awareness. Don't force them into regret. Don't perform your healing for their attention. Build a life so authentic, so grounded, and so aligned with your values that your future no longer depends on whether they return to your past. Your absence becomes powerful when it stops being a message to them and becomes a commitment to yourself. And once you understand that your absence has to become a new reality rather than a temporary tactic, you arrive at another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow someone to experience the consequences of their own pattern. Not punish them, not manipulate them, not make them jealous. Simply stop protecting them from reality. Because every relationship teaches people what their behavior produces. If someone repeatedly withdraws and you repeatedly chase them, what does their behavior produce? More attention, more reassurance, more emotional labor from you. In a strange way, the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. They pull away, you repair. They become distant, you pursue. They become uncertain, you reassure. They create emotional instability, and you become responsible for restoring stability. Eventually, the relationship becomes organized around one person's avoidance and the other person's compensation. And that's where you have to step back, because you cannot create accountability for another adult. You can explain your feelings. You can communicate your needs. You can offer patience. You can invite honest conversation. But there comes a moment when continued accommodation stops being compassion and starts becoming participation in the problem. That's a difficult distinction. Compassion says, I understand why you're struggling. Self-abandonment says, because you're struggling, I will accept anything. Those are not the same thing. You can understand someone's fear of intimacy without allowing that fear to dictate the terms of your life. You can recognize that someone may have learned to protect themselves through emotional distance without volunteering to become the person who absorbs the consequences. This is where boundaries become transformative. A boundary is not a weapon. It's not an ultimatum designed to force someone into compliance. A boundary simply defines what you will participate in. You might say, I care about you, but I cannot continue a relationship where communication disappears every time emotions become uncomfortable. That's not punishment, that's clarity. And if they choose to withdraw after hearing that boundary, you don't chase them to make the discomfort disappear. You let the consequence exist. That doesn't mean you want them to suffer. It means you stop rescuing the relationship from every consequence created by their choices. And psychologically, this can be confronting because people learn through consequences. If every painful consequence is immediately removed by someone else, there is little incentive to examine the behavior that created it. But when you step back, reality becomes the teacher. If they withdraw and discover that you no longer chase, they have an opportunity to reflect. If they communicate and discover that you respond with maturity rather than emotional chaos, they have an opportunity to build differently. If they continue avoiding, they also receive information. Their current pattern is incompatible with the relationship they say they want. And that's valuable information for both people. You are no longer trying to diagnose them, fix them, or force them into emotional growth. You're simply observing. And observation is powerful because it replaces fantasy with evidence. Don't judge someone by what they promise when they're afraid of losing you. Watch what they consistently do when they feel secure. Don't measure change by one emotional conversation. Measure it through patterns. Do they communicate? Do they take responsibility? Do they repair after conflict? Do they tolerate vulnerability? Do they make space for your needs? Do they become more consistent over time? Those behaviors tell you far more than whether they suddenly miss you. And here's the deeper philosophical principle. Love without boundaries can become self-betrayal. You are not obligated to remain available simply because you understand someone's wounds. You are not required to wait indefinitely because someone is not ready. And you certainly do not have to sacrifice your peace to prove that your love is unconditional. Healthy love contains freedom. You are free to love them. They are free to choose. And you are free to choose what you will do with their choice. That's maturity. So let the consequences exist. Let reality speak. Let their choices reveal their capacity. You don't have to break an avoidant. You simply have to stop breaking yourself to keep them comfortable. The moment you stop rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices, you give reality the power to teach what your words never could. And now we arrive at the deepest point of all, because everything we've discussed leads here. The thing that truly changes the dynamic is not making an avoidant afraid of losing you. It is becoming so grounded in yourself that you no longer need them to choose you in order to feel chosen by life. That's a completely different level of power. Think about what happens when someone has had consistent access to your patience, your understanding, your emotional availability, and your willingness to keep trying. Over time, they may begin to experience those qualities as ordinary, not because they aren't valuable, but because human beings can become accustomed to what is consistently available. And then something changes. You stop offering unlimited access to yourself, not out of revenge, not because you're trying to create scarcity, because you have finally understood that your presence is valuable. You begin to recognize that love is not measured by how much you are willing to tolerate. Commitment is not measured by how long you can wait. And loyalty is not proven by repeatedly accepting behavior that violates your deepest standards. You can love someone deeply and still say, "This is no longer healthy for me." That sentence represents an enormous psychological evolution, because many people believe that choosing themselves means they didn't love the other person enough. In reality, sometimes choosing yourself is the first evidence that you have finally understood what healthy love requires. Healthy love does not demand that you disappear. It does not require you to silence your needs. It does not ask you to become smaller so another person can remain emotionally comfortable. And it certainly does not require you to convince someone to value what you bring. When you stop doing that, the entire relationship dynamic changes. If the avoidant eventually looks back, they may remember the person who was patient with them, the person who listened, the person who gave chances, the person who tried to understand what others might have judged. But what may become most significant is realizing that person is no longer standing where they left them. You have changed. Your standards have changed. Your relationship with yourself has changed. And that can be far more confronting than silence, because silence can end. But personal growth changes the terms of access. If they return, they cannot simply return to the old arrangement. They have to meet the person you've become. And that means the question is no longer, do you want me? The question becomes, what are you prepared to build? Sir, that's a completely different standard. Missing someone is easy. Wanting someone back is easy. Feeling regret is easy. But consistency is difficult. Accountability is difficult. Emotional vulnerability is difficult. Building trust after damaging it is difficult. That's why you must never confuse someone's emotional reaction to losing you with their capacity to love you properly. They may miss you and still be unable to meet your needs. They may regret losing you and still repeat the same pattern. They may become afraid that you've moved on and still not possess the emotional maturity required for a healthy relationship. Your responsibility is not to interpret every sign. Your responsibility is to observe reality. And this is where your freedom becomes complete. If they come back with genuine change, you can evaluate it. If they come back with the same inconsistency, you can recognize it. If they never come back, you can continue forward. Your peace is no longer dependent on the outcome. That's the real victory. Because the ultimate goal was never to make the avoidant regret losing you. The ultimate goal was to become someone who doesn't need another person's regret to validate their value. You don't need them to say, "I should have treated you better." You know how you deserve to be treated. You don't need them to say, "You were different." You know what you brought into the relationship. You don't need them to return before you allow yourself to move forward. You can honor what the relationship meant without allowing it to define what your future becomes. And that is when you understand what actually breaks the cycle. Not silence, not games, not jealousy, not manipulation, self-respect. Because when you truly choose yourself, you stop trying to control whether they lose you and start making sure you never lose yourself again. Don't become unforgettable so they regret losing you. Become unshakable so you never regret choosing yourself. So let me leave you with this, because if you remember nothing else from this entire conversation, remember this. What actually breaks the cycle with an avoidant is not silence. It is self-respect backed by action. Silence can make someone wonder where you are, but growth changes where you are going. You don't need to disappear hoping they panic. You don't need to become cold hoping they chase. You don't need to manufacture jealousy, create uncertainty, or strategically withhold affection. Those are still attempts to control another person's emotions. And the moment you make their reaction your objective, you've given them power again. The real transformation happens when you stop asking, "How do I make them realize what they lost?" and start asking, "What am I no longer willing to lose within myself?" Your peace, your dignity, your standards, your emotional stability, your future. You can understand an avoidant person's fears without becoming responsible for healing them. You can have compassion for their wounds without allowing those wounds to become an excuse for hurting you. You can love someone and still recognize that love alone cannot create emotional availability. That's the mature truth. You cannot force someone into vulnerability. You cannot convince someone into commitment. You cannot communicate perfectly enough to eliminate another person's fear of intimacy. At some point, they have to choose growth for themselves. And you have to choose yourself. That means allowing consequences to exist. If they withdraw, you don't automatically chase. If they become inconsistent, you don't compensate by giving more. If they refuse to communicate, you don't spend your life translating their silence. You observe, you decide, you move accordingly. And if they return someday, don't ask only, "Do they miss me?" Ask, "Have they changed?" Don't ask, "Are they afraid of losing me?" Ask, "Are they capable of building something healthy with me?" Don't ask, "Do they finally understand my value?" Ask, "Can their behavior consistently reflect that understanding?" Because words can reveal emotion. Behavior reveals capacity. And that's the standard you deserve. Maybe they come back. Maybe they don't. Maybe they eventually understand what they lost. Maybe they never do. But your healing cannot depend on their realization. Your future cannot depend on their timing. And your worth cannot depend on their ability to recognize it. The greatest victory is not watching an avoidant come running back. The greatest victory is reaching the point where you no longer need them to. Because now you're no longer living from fear of abandonment. You're living from self-respect. You're no longer asking someone else to confirm that you're valuable. You're building a life that confirms it every single day. And perhaps one day they look back and realize they lost someone who genuinely cared. That's their realization. Your realization is even more important. You never needed to chase someone into loving you. You needed to stop abandoning yourself while waiting for them to choose you. So don't make your goal to become the person they can't forget. Become the person you can finally trust. Don't make them regret losing you. Make sure you never regret losing yourself. Because the most powerful thing you can do is not make an avoidant afraid of losing you. It is becoming so secure in who you are that whether they stay or go, you still choose yourself.